Welcome back for the break. I'd like to welcome you again to State of Cybersecurity. Thanks for hanging in there to the end. I think you'll find our closer today is very much worthwhile to listen to. I've had the opportunity to spend some time with him over the last year or so. It's a remarkable story, and I think it's the kind of thing that not only talks about the technicalities and strategy and tactics of cybersecurity, but talks about building the cybersecurity brand called you, which I do another series of in my work at Chime. But I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to look at this from a sort of a multifaceted aspect. And this is the guy to do it because he goes the entire gamut. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Benoit Desjardins, who is our guest today. I won't even begin to go through the resume. It is a combination of Renaissance man, technologist, and just citizen of the universe. So without further ado, I just like to start out, just introduce yourself, and I know you'll go through that as we start talking, but how did you early on get interested in hacking? I mean, this is one of the reasons that we wanted to talk about this day, is to get the hacker's point of view and then look at the transition going from hacking to where you're right now. Were there certain emotional or intellectual triggers that said, I mean, I'm just like an opiate, I'm getting a buzz out of this, and I don't want to talk anymore. I want to listen to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to talk with you, as usual. Let's go back a long time ago in the 1980s. That was before I got into medical school. I had just won the Quebec Mathematics Olympiad and had a big prize money. And so I bought my first computer. And of course, at that time, I learned everything I could about computers, just soaked knowledge like a sponge. I taught myself to program in like half a dozen languages, from assembly to Pascal, all old languages, but languages that from those times. I was motivated mainly by a massive curiosity, not a buzz or anything like that, but I was just extraordinarily curious. I wanted to know everything I could about computers. And of course, I started hacking at a time because I wanted to have fun with my computers. Small things really at the beginning. Just let's stop here. I forgot to do one thing. I'm so.
So, Benoit, with my long-winded introduction at the very beginning, because I get excited about listening to you every time it happens, there must have been an earlier point, an interest level where the hacking begun, and were there sort of emotional or intellectual triggers that you had that said, "Man, I got a new computer, whatever, and then I really, really want to take it to its limits in a different way."
Well, first of all, thank you so very much for inviting me today. It's a pleasure, as usual, to
My
talk.
pleasure indeed.
Okay, let's go back to the early 1980s. That was before medical school. I had just won the Quebec Mathematics Olympiad, and with a big prize money, well, big at the time, just peanuts, in retrospective, but it was enough to buy my first computer. And so when I got that first computer, I learned as much as possible about computers. I soaked knowledge like a sponge.
Hmm.
I taught myself to program in several languages, from assembly to Pascal. These were the languages at the time. They're like way past their primes. But I was heavily motivated by curiosity. And then from there, I started hacking small things, basically trying to get into sites, mainly universities. At the time, there were no laws against that. It was at the beginning, and I was really pretty young. But I was always following a strict code of not doing any harm in my hacking, what is now coined ethical hacking. Interestingly, that was like 15 years before the term was coined by the IBM vice president, John Patrick, in 1995. And I also did some software cracking, removing protection on computer games, anything that enabled me to expand my horizons. But then I got accepted into medical school and I dropped everything. I really would have been tempted to go into dark places, and I didn't want it to get into trouble. So when I got into medical school, I just stopped cold.
Interesting. So I remember one of the other times we talked that there was another turning point that was related to your son and that influenced your career shift. How does one's child influence a career shift as opposed to vice versa typically?
Yeah, so this was after medical school. My son was in college in computer science, and he kind of lacked drive and motivation. So I decided to bring him to DEF CON in Vegas in 2017. I wanted to expose him to a bunch of young people who were highly motivated by computers, so a bunch of hackers. And the only thing I wanted during that conference was to attend a small session, an evening session on cybersecurity and healthcare in a small room, about 30 chairs. Um, nothing fancy. When I got there to that room, there were 500 people waiting in line at the door to get in. So they moved us to a larger room to fit everybody. And then I learned about, the recent cyber attacks, ransomware attacks by WannaCry, NotPetya, which really, affected the entire planet and transformed cybersecurity and healthcare into an extremely hot field. And so that really reignited my passion for cybersecurity, and I decided to re-enter the field formally. And I did two things. First of all, I refreshed my hacking skills through self-training, a bunch of cyber certifications, some hacking competitions. In 2023, for example, I participated in the NSA Codebreaker Challenge, and I was one of a few hackers, like 100 hackers out of 5,000, to successfully complete the challenge. So I was very proud of that. Recently, I was elected in the CEH Hall of Fame of the best ethical hackers on the planet. And the second thing that I did is that I connected with top leaders in cybersecurity and healthcare at specialized conferences. So it enabled me to create long-term friendships and connections and to get invited to speak at many, many conferences. I've spoke at many, many, many conferences since that time.
So, and then you wandered along in your career, and I know that you spent one of the first times we met. You were working at Penn Medicine. Go Quakers! Uh, went to school there, and then on to back onto to Canada. So tell me a little bit about the work that you did at Penn, and also a little bit about your other background in addition to cybersecurity, with your radiology background.
So, okay, I spent 16 years at Penn, and then I moved to Canada last year. At Penn Medicine, I had a triple role. First of all, I was an Ivy League academic radiologist in cardiovascular imaging. That's really my day job, what pays my salary. And I was also co-leader of a research lab in imaging of arrhythmia by cardiac MR and cardiac CT, and also did a bunch of teaching in radiology in general. My second hat was that I was an expert in artificial intelligence, which was the area of my PhD from the 1990s, so well before AI was sexy. And
But it was sexy in radiology from a very early stage, right?
not as much in those days.
Uh-huh.
And then my third hat is an expert in cybersecurity and a white hat hacker. So specifically in cybersecurity at Penn, I helped train the latest recruits into the Penn Medicine cyber team. We did some biweekly hacking competitions. And I just taught them how to hack, essentially, how to solve problems, how to approach hacking problems so that they could learn how hackers could get into their systems. I also worked on different research projects, especially on cybersecurity and medical imaging. I also led the cybersecurity course at RSNA, which is the biggest radiology conference in the world. It's in
Mhm.
Chicago every year.
Enormous. Yep.
I joined many of the top cybersecurity committees, like HIMSS and then, SIM. I also did a stint as a consultant for the FBI. Interesting, not something that I expected. And then I won, a couple of hacking competitions, including that, NSA Codebreaker annual competition. And last year, I relocated to Montreal. And here I'm kind of doing pretty much the same stuff as I did in the United States.
Mhm.
A couple things more, like I've become CMIO of my department, and as well as I've taken some prominent roles at the level of the government and
Mhm.
in IT and AI and cyber also.
So, I mean, you've been on the good guy side and on the ethical hacking side as well. Where do you see, having been on both sides, where do you see some of the blind spots being in enterprises as it relates to cybersecurity? Where do you see the chinks in the armor, and is that a relationship? Is there a relationship between that? Is it technology and culture in the enterprise, or is it largely technology these days?
Well, there's many weaknesses in institutions these days. I mean, most attacks will start with a phishing email. And so that's how cyber criminals get through the hospital safety perimeter. They initially gather information and then they target specific people, and then they could, potentially send them emails, phishing emails, to install software on the employee's computer. And, the employee eventually, might initially be outside the hospital working on vacation, for example, and then download some email, have some software installed on their computer without them realizing that this is happening. And then when they go back to work after their vacation, they hook up their computer to the hospital, and that software spreads to the entire hospital. This is how, for example, the University of Vermont got hacked a couple of years ago. An employee was on vacation, received an email, installed some software. Then when he got back to work, hooked up his computer to the hospital, and then within 24 hours, essentially, the whatever ransomware had taken over the entire hospital.
But as
And
a
of
as
course,
a as a as a as a as a quote unquote professional hacker at one point, is that rudimentary to even start with phishing? Or like today, if you were going to hack something, would you have another backdoor that you knew that you could enter without having to go through the rudimentary phishing routine?
well, there's many different approaches that you can use. I mean, this is by far the most popular, obviously. And then there's other approaches, such as, you scan a bunch of IP addresses, and then you run some, exploits on the
Hmm.
addresses to identify whether, there's some ports that are open, that are
Hmm.
vulnerable, and then you get in that way. Um, there's, of course, if you have in your hands some zero-day exploit that hasn't been patched, then, you can target hospitals that way. Very often, people, hackers, they get patches from Microsoft, and then they reverse engineering them to identify what they patched, and then they find some like zero-day exploits unpatched,
Hmm.
in those, and then they try to hack into hospitals before these hospitals have the time to install the Microsoft patch. And more, people work remotely, compared to with respect to hospitals. Like I know in
Right.
radiology, more and more radiologists will work from home. I do that. I've got my workstation at home, and I work at home like at least a day a week, and so that works very well. Another problem is that, is many problems, obviously, but another one is network segmentation in hospitals. Like you get a hacker who walks into a hospital, and he just has to plug his laptop on any kind of, Ethernet jack in any hallway or small room. And then they have access to the entire network of the hospital, because the hospital is not segmented. And that
Hmm.
gives them access to tens of thousands of connected medical devices. So that's a big weakness. And one of the problems specific to hospital is that very often you've got networked medical devices that should be patched, but they are in constant use by patients. Like, for example, a ventilator. I mean, suppose that you find a vulnerability in a ventilator and you want to patch it. Well, the patient is hooked up to the ventilator. You're not going to unplug the ventilator and wait for it to reboot and install the patch. You're going to kill the patients. And so you got to wait until that patient gets better or just dies on the ventilator, and then you patch it. But so there's a bunch of medical devices that are in use constantly for a long period of time where that you cannot patch. And so that is a big area of weakness. But there's many, many other problems, obviously. But that's just a couple of examples of them.
So tell me a little bit more about radiology specifically. Is radiology different? Is it changing because of the sheer amount of unstructured data and imagery that we have coming in with all the storage in the cloud and artificial intelligence on top of it? Uh, what would you say to CIOs or CISOs that are listening today about the radiology department?
Well, radiology is a prime target for several reasons. First of all, it's by far the most digitized and interconnected specialty in medicine. We deal with many kinds of interconnecting systems. We have a PACS, we have a radiology information system, we have the EMR, we have a bunch of vendor platforms like post-processing workstations, and we have the cloud. And all these platforms are exchanging data continuously, and that makes a huge attack surface for cyber criminals. And also, as I said earlier, more and more radiologists will have workstations at home and they work remotely from the hospital. So it's not just that you have to protect the hospital. You have this huge attack surface that goes well beyond the hospital, where you have a bunch of laptops or home workstations that can get hacked. And then, these stations, these PAC systems, they can get hacked. For example, when I was helping Penn with their hacking exercises, on one week, we had a hacking exercise which was to try to hack into a PAC system. It was a test PAC system, not our real PAC system. And I was able to hack into it by inserting some PHP code into the header of a DICOM image file. That's like the format of medical images. And I was able to upload it to the PAC system and to execute a remote command, remotely. And that enabled me to take over the entire PAC system. So that's something that can really happen. Another thing that is a problem in radiology, as well as many other areas of medicine, is that we depend on legacy infrastructure. Very often you got equipment that was designed a long time ago that is network connected, but it was designed when cybersecurity was not really a priority. People weren't talking about cybersecurity 20 years ago, and so they just made the best possible machines without thinking about cybersecurity. And now they're still used. They have outdated operating system that cannot be upgraded anymore. And so they're really, really vulnerable. You can't patch them. And so you're going to find a way to isolate them. Another thing in radiology is that it has very valuable data. I mean, we deal with medical images, but we also deal with patient identifiers, billing information, a bunch of diagnostic details that are not really imaging related. And all these things are top targets for cyber criminals. In terms of medical images, there's several cybersecurity issues about medical images. A couple of years ago, I built a Blue Ribbon team made up of the two leaders of the DICOM security work group, as well as a bunch of hackers. And so we identified many vulnerabilities in medical images, and we published that in the radiology literature. And I've given like a whole bunch of talks about that. The DICOM standard, which is the standard for all medical images, has some security features in it, like encryption, digital signatures, and stuff like that. But the problem is that most of them are not implemented simply because encryption and digital signatures, they deal with keys and certificates, and there's just no practical management for these entities in healthcare. And so, to be able to implement that properly and use that, you need this kind of, management of keys and certificates. And people are looking into that. Another issue that's been identified over the last couple of years is that you have a whole bunch of DICOM image servers, so PAC systems, that are openly exposed to the internet. I mean, a couple of years ago, three different companies scanned the entire internet and found, thousands and thousands of exposed medical images servers. They
Mm.
were able to steal images from that. They were able to, find, tens of millions of images that were exposed to the internet. And one of the three companies, Greenbone Networks, they decided, okay, well, let's inform all the places that have weak image servers, exposed medical, image servers, that their server is exposed so that it could fix it. And so they said, okay, fix those as soon as possible. And then 6 months later, they decided to rescan the internet to look for exposed servers. And they found even more than the first
Really?
time.
Yeah.
So that's really sad.
So, I mean, there are obviously other cases. I mean, is there a change healthcare version of radiology exposures to a massive scale, or is it pretty much like the one you were talking about?
So
CrowdStrike.
I mean, well, yeah, well, I mean, there's been many highly publicized cyber attacks involving hospitals or large networks of hospitals involving, like, in Change, healthcare, 190 million patient records. Now, most of these attacks were not radiology specifics, but
Mhm.
radiology departments are always caught in the middle in those
Yep.
attacks because they're really connected and because imaging is such a central part of modern healthcare. Now, in addition, there's a regular stream of small radiology practice that get hacked every year. And this has devastating consequences. Most of the time it's just, ransomware attacks or regular data breaches. And of course, most of the time this is followed by big HIPAA fines as well as, potentially
Mhm.
class action lawsuits. Earlier this year, for example, out of like the many small, radiology practices that got hacked, one was an especially sad case. A radiology practice in North Carolina was hacked in February 2025. And after the hack, they didn't want to deal with the HIPAA fines and the class action lawsuits. And they decided to just shut down
Of course.
completely immediately after the cyber attack. I mean, this practice had been in business for 50 years,
Mm.
providing valuable medical service to the community, as well as, employment to a bunch of radiologists. And one day they just get hit by cyber criminals, and then bam, the next day they're out of business for good. There are not that many things that can do that. I mean, a cyber attack and maybe like a meteorite falling in your radiology practice. Besides that, not that
Right.
many other
Same
things.
odds. Same odds.
So, but in reality, no medical practice is safe. I mean, you got a bunch of groups with decades of history that somehow in one day lose access to all their data, and either they can't proceed because they lost their data, or they get destroyed by the following class action suit, destroyed financially, and they just cannot survive. And so they're forced to permanently shut down immediately or within a few months after a cyber attack. And not just small practices, some big hospitals have been forced to shut down after cyber attacks. So that's a big thing. Now, as you know, organized crime in nation states like North Korea and Russia, they run extensive hacking campaigns against US hospitals. If a hospital becomes a direct target, it will get hacked, no matter how good your defenses are. Fortunately, most attacks are not targeted. They're rather broad campaigns trying to find weaknesses in whole areas of the internet, and the practices with the weakest defenses will fall first. So the important thing is that, to get in a position to detect the attacks as early as possible and then limit the damages as much as possible.
Mhm.
It can take months to detect a cyber attack, but takes only 5 hours for a cyber criminal to steal all your sensitive data.
Interesting. Interesting. So you had mentioned earlier on that you're involved with the government in Canada. You would drop the FBI name here. So how do you think governments should get involved in cybersecurity policy? And I'll make it a two-part question, as they say in the political interviews. What's different about Canada?
Well, first of all, in terms of policy, I'll talk about policy and then I'll talk about Canada. So the policy in the United States is based on a very noble principle. You're dealing with protected healthcare data, PHI,
Hmm.
and it needs to be protected. That's simple, okay? And the problem is that when there's a breach, the US government will conclude that a hospital is at fault for the breach, has been negligent, and is punished by paying huge HIPAA fines. And this is almost always followed by massive class action lawsuits, punishing hospitals even more. And this, series of big fines and punitive measures against hospital is part of the cause of the epidemic of breaches and ransomware attacks in healthcare, because the reasoning is really, really flawed. I mean, this is not an approach that works. I mean, a quote that's been wrongly attributed to Einstein is that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, this is what's happening right now in the United States in cybersecurity and healthcare. You continue to punish hospitals and hope that things will get better. Now, let's put things into perspective. Look at the Pentagon, okay? The Pentagon is pretty much the most cyber secure environment on earth. And
Okay.
it has a huge budget for defense, and it has a huge army of defenders. Yet it gets hacked over and over again. And so when hospital gets hacked, and they're blamed for the hack, essentially what you're telling them is, you don't have cyber defenses that are stronger than those of the Pentagon, yet with massively smaller budget and massively smaller teams of defenders. And this is really unrealistic. And cyber criminals are well aware of this unusual US
Hmm.
situation, and they take advantage of that. Like, for example, if they want to do a ransomware attack against a hospital, they will typically exfiltrate data before encrypting it, and then they will say, okay, pay us the ransom if you want your data back. Even if you have backups, we're going to leak the information if you don't pay us the ransom. And so hospitals are put in a terrible position. They either have to choose between paying a $10 million ransom or facing a 100 million class action lawsuit for leaked information.
Right.
And so paying the ransom usually is the cheaper option of the two. And this has unfortunately transformed the US justice system into a de facto enabler of ransomware payments and an indirect sponsor of organized crime and hostile nation states. The solution really is to stop blaming victims of cybercrime and help them build better defenses rather than punishing them. And also, it would help if they could teach critical thinking abilities in US law schools. Now, let's get back to Canada. Okay, I moved to Canada about a year ago. The environment in cybersecurity is dramatically different. Okay, in the US, okay, hospitals are separate businesses. They're responsible for protecting their own medical data. They use local solutions and local cyber defense teams. In Canada, healthcare is more centralized and government funded. And there's also extensive data sharing between the different hospitals within a specific province. Like, for example, in my case as a radiologist, I can access all patient imaging data performed in all hospitals over the province of Quebec because everything is connected. And next year, I'll be able to do the same with all patient clinical information, not just images, but everything. Now, in Canada, cybersecurity is a shared responsibility between hospitals and the government. So typically, hospitals will handle breach detections, but helped by government monitoring tools. And if they get hacked, then the government cyber defense team will take over after a breach occurs. And so that has many advantages. First of all, it avoids duplication of resources. Also, it ensures the same protection across both small and large hospitals. And it's really a provincial-wide approach to cybersecurity that is very cost-effective and efficient. Now, on another hand, the legal landscape between the two countries, the US and Canada, is massively different. Okay. In the US, you have to deal with HIPAA regulations,
Hmm.
and then you have to deal with massive class action lawsuits following cyber attacks. In Canada, the disclosure requirements are minimal. And also, the Canadian courts refuse to certify frivolous class action lawsuits against crime victims. Rather, the government focuses on helping hospitals strengthen their defenses rather than punishing them for being victims of cybercrime. And also, Canada has learned from the complete fiasco in the US, how cybersecurity is handled, and they just avoid repeating the same mistakes. Uh, Also, this is, I think, one of the consequences of teaching critical thinking abilities in Canadian high school. It helps down the line. Now, of course, nothing is perfect. There are rare exceptions. For example, right now, at the moment, a series of Ontario hospitals are facing a huge class action lawsuit, like, hundreds of millions, like in the United States, following a 2023 cyber attack in which patient files were exposed to the dark web after the hospital refused to pay a ransom to support organized crime. But this is like the exception, not the rule in Canada.
Would you say that because of what you just mentioned, that data hostage negotiating is much lower in Canada, that it just doesn't occur as much, or it just nobody's going to say, "Hey, I'm negotiating with a bad guy." So sometimes it's a mystery. You just never know.
Well, definitely. And also, basically, the government takes over after hack. And so the government would have to negotiate. And, when you are hackers and you try to, instill fear in a hospital to make them pay, it's easier to deal with a small hospital than
Right.
with a big government.
Yeah.
When they have to deal with a big government,
The bureaucracy,
it's much more intimidating for a hacker.
the bureaucracy of hacking, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So interesting. So we got a couple, just a few more minutes. I lose my journalistic credentials and be called for malpractice if I didn't mention something about how you see AI is progressing in terms of both the good guys and the arms race with the bad guys. I mean, how much further are the bad guys ahead in mastering AI versus the good guys?
Well, AI is going to change medicine in many different ways and also will change cybersecurity. Like in my field, radiology, AI is transforming our field dramatically. It's really the perfect environment for AI. Now, in cybersecurity, AI can be used for both offensive and defensive aspects. For example, in offensive, one of the main problems is that AI will make non-specialists with limited hacking skill sets very, very dangerous. They're not expert coders, they're not even hackers, but they
Hmm.
just can buy an AI software and become very, very dangerous. And that will dramatically increase the pool of attackers. Now, from a defensive point of view, of course, AI will help speed up detection of intrusions and
Hmm.
attacks. As I said earlier, a hacker gets only takes 5 hours to exfiltrate your important data. So you got to detect the attack very, very early. And AI can do that. Um, AI is, running 24/7. I mean, it doesn't sleep in the middle of the night like, humans do.
Hmm.
And so it can really detect these attacks very early. It can also constantly scan the internet and traffic flows to try to identify small attacks that are too subtle for humans to detect. And that's something that AI is very good at. But AI is being used very creatively from bad guys. Like for example, earlier this year, actually last year, was a really interesting hack in Hong Kong involving deepfake videos. So there was a simple web meeting involving all the top leaders in the company, as well as the CFO, as well as one employee in billing. And that employee in billing was instructed by all the top leaders to send $25 million to different bank accounts, and she knew all of them, and she decided to send the information. The problem is that this employee was the only human in that meeting. Every single other person in that meeting was an AI generated avatar. And
Well,
so that was, massive hack. So
yeah.
that's, a big problem. And it's important to realize that attackers have always had a huge edge over defenders. So an attacker only needs one successful attack out of like 1,000 tries to break in,
Hmm.
whereas the defender needs to block all the
All
attacks.
of them every
And
day.
so if one gets through, then the hospital gets hacked. And so even in the AI arms race, the attacker still have an edge, but we do the best we can in terms of defenders.
Interesting. So just a closing question. It goes back to our very beginning of the conversation. You introduced me to the term polymath. So I'm hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And you've got an interesting brand. I'm a student of personal branding. You're a renowned medical educator as well as all the other credentials that you have. How would you advise medical students in terms of being a Benoit? Or is it something that entirely a personal preference? Do you encourage people to develop the most positive way a very complex personal brand so they can draw from
I've
those?
never put any effort in personal branding. I've achieved a lot in, three different fields. I'm a world
Sometimes
expert
that's
in
the
three
best way
different
to do it.
fields.
It's not putting an effort into it.
But I've never been motivated by fame. My goal is to help as much as possible and have an impact on the world during my limited time on Earth. And I've achieved a lot. And there's many things that I don't really publicize. Like one of them that's interesting about me, that makes me truly unique, something that I've done all my life, and that very few people know about, is that every 5 years or so, I undertake outside of work what I call a new grand challenge. I give myself 5 years to become a top expert in a new field in which I've never worked, in which I know absolutely nothing. I just
Mhm.
start from scratch. Things that I've done is, becoming black belt at Taekwondo, becoming a Boy Scout leader, becoming a pilot, becoming a master marksman. And my current grand challenge is to become a top drone racing pilot. Now,
Great.
what I would recommend for you students is simply, just follow your interests and identify your skill sets. List your real skills online. Don't lie. Don't become a fake personality like so many people are becoming. Try to stay 100% genuine all the time. And importantly, learn about the world outside the US because it's a big world and you might have a very limited perspective by being in the US only.
Closing thought. Let me flip the question another way. If you had to find the greatest flaw in medical education, both or either in Canada or in the United States, where would you see that the chinks are?
Well, the problem in medical education is that there's so much to learn and so little time. Okay. And so many years ago, there was a change in the curriculum. Instead of, focusing on just, filling your brain with tons of stuff to kind of teach critical thinking abilities in doctors and then how to search literature, how to find information, how to look at a patient globally. And I think there should be more emphasis on that in healthcare. Now, in cybersecurity, that's a different ball game. But in terms of medicine, that's how I would focus it.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. We've reached the end of our formal presentation. I'm sure I haven't stopped you in the middle for questions from the audience. I'm sure we have some questions in chat here. So we'll take it from there and go on to the chat.
Thank you very much. I'm open to any question.